The day it disappeared was the day it was healed.
YOLO composing gloves here. And today we're going to be talking about oscilloscopes, vectorscopes, and spectrograms, how they're used, a little bit on how they work. And I'm going to do an overview real quick. So if all you want to know is how they work and what they're used for, we'll talk about that. And then I'll go into more detail on each one as is appropriate. So this is aimed towards the beginner, but if you want to know a little bit more, perhaps about like what exactly goes on, this could be useful for you too. So basically, we have these three scopes that are really pretty important to understanding because they give you information about your song, about your sound, and it's also just nice to know generally what they're used for. Maybe they have a purpose you didn't know about. So let's just start off with oscilloscopes. So oscilloscopes, actually, you don't see these things too often in use anymore as far as being used to analyze a track because we have waveforms. So a waveform is way better because a waveform, what it is it's a graph, right, of the amplitude of our signal over time. And the whole thing, we can view the whole waveform at once. Like, oh, look, I suspect that this sound is going to be loud at the beginning and it's going to get softer. That's, according to the graph I have here. And if I play it, that's what I have. But if I were to look at an oscilloscope, I'm able to view this information in real time. However, that relationship's not immediately apparent to me because it's not in front of me right now. Right now, I have a blank oscilloscope. So waveforms are much better for giving you information about your mix and about your the volume levels at a particular moment. But on oscilloscopes, they might be going, what's an oscilloscope used for? Well, there's really, I think, two common uses, and one of them is not very common, if that makes any sense. One of them is syncing. So I have a oscilloscope down here for my voice, and I find it a preferable method for me when I have no other way to sync my voice. I have a hardcore way of just looking at an oscilloscope and syncing it up. Works great for me, so that's what I do. Sometimes in a video, I'll have it just randomly go out of sync because of video skip or a buffering error or something. And so this is a really nice backup. Sometimes, I just let it go. So that's one reason. The other reason is if you have a waveform, maybe you're doing some sound design, like a sine wave, you might want to be able to view this sine wave. And so here it's like, oh, look, I can view my sine wave and I might be able to mess with its period and get visual feedback. And that can cause some creative inspiration. And also it's just fun to mess around with. So there's not really a super practical purpose for it, but it can be a very inspirational tool. And it has purposes in other fields that are a little more applicable. But as far as audio production, that's what it is. It's basically a real-time waveform display. And it's just showing you the amplitude and good for sound design. So that's an oscilloscope. Let's move on to, by the way, when I say oscilloscope, there are different types of oscilloscope. A vectorscope is actually a specific kind of oscilloscope. One control that I do want to mention real quick, I almost skipped it, was on an oscilloscope, you will notice that if I play a certain note, like that looks crazy. Like that's pretty hard to digest. And you may want it to sync up because you might be going, this is a sine wave. Why isn't it syncing up? Like if I go to this oscilloscope, this one's frozen. Like why? What's the deal here? Well, what most oscilloscopes have is a control to control the synchronization. So this one has like a low pass option and a free running option. And this is just how it detects what it should do as far as synchronizing. You see, if I have free running, this looks just as crazy. Most of the time, I think you'll find it preferable to have it synchronized. And so to do that, a lot of them will include some sort of an update control. So for example, if I know I'm going to be playing C, I can select one of the C controls here as my note I'm going to hit, and it syncs up really well. Really nice. So that's what's going on there. Let's go ahead and move on over to the spectrogram. So the spectrogram is a really cool thing, probably the most used thing in a studio as far as just a really important mixing tool. as far as visual feedback goes. So a spectrogram, all it does is specto, meaning spectrum. So it takes a sound, and we know our sound is made of high frequencies and low frequencies and all these frequencies, but we want to know, which frequencies. A lot of the time, we want to know specifically where are these frequencies bunched up. And once you get good enough, your ears will just kind of clue you into this, but it is super nice to have visual feedback, and that is what the spectrogram does. It takes any signal and it's like a cheese grater. It just shaves them into a bunch of individual frequencies. And so if I were to, for example, I'm playing a sine wave right now, and we see it's one frequency. And that's what we would expect to see. If I give it a sound that's a little more dense though, we could see all these frequencies appear. And this can be really helpful for us. And it's there for our viewing and technical pleasure. We're able to see, I want to change this or that about my sound. And mixing, it can be really helpful for identifying things that are masking each other. And a lot of plugins will actually, well, not a lot, but there's a couple out there that you can actually put plugins on. You can instantiate one on like a kick drum and one on a bass guitar. And it will tell you which frequencies in the spectrum are overlapping. And then you can adjust it accordingly. A plugin that can do this, for example, is Neutron. Check this out. It blows my mind. So I can open up one neutron. Let's put this on Citrus. So I can open up a neutron here. It's an isotope. Oh no, it's not under N. It's just neutron. It's kind of weird. And when it opens under the equalizer section, I can actually see which is masking with the spectrogram. Let's see here. Let's get one citrus playing one thing. Let's have them really mask each other really good. Let's have this one play a C3, and then let's have the next one play the same C3. And we are going to go to the next instance of citrus and put a neutron on that. And so we're going to look at this first one. And we're going to go to masking neutron 2, and it shows us the second one, and then it's going to tell us which ones are masking through our spectrogram. Well, this is a little different, but check it out. If I play it in the pattern, there we go. Yeah, I don't know what the deal was with that. Okay. So we see it's telling us at our fundamental, we have a huge masking problem. And then some masking is not always a bad thing. It just means that one sound's covering up another sound. It's masking it. If you've ever been in a crowd that's really loud and tried screaming and you found out you cannot even hear your own voice, you've experienced masking in real time. And so that's what this allows you to do. It's kind of weird that it wasn't going there for a second. Maybe one of you can point out exactly why. But anyways, that is one use of a spectrogram. And in EQ, you can oftentimes, the better way to do this is just to look straight up at an EQ. Now, this is so common, it's built into equalizers. We can look at an EQ and just say, these are the frequencies that are resonating. And I'm able to make adjustments now with my EQ. And you want to do, your ears are king. So your ears will tell you what you need to do, but your eyes can help you pinpoint things and test things out pretty fast. So they're pretty helpful for that reason. It's also common in a dynamic EQ type of setting or any sort of dynamic processor. It can be very helpful. So for example, a common thing is to split the frequency up. But I want to show you one. Like here's TDR Nova, and I can turn on the spectrogram, and it gives me a curve basically of the frequencies. And a lot of times you might have a signal that you want to bring the headroom down on, and that's your goal, to bring not bring headroom down, but make there be more headroom, if that makes any sense. So what we're going to do is we say, well, look here, I'm peaking right here. And if you have a voice, a recording that's peaking in a particular range, what you would do is you turn on the threshold and bring it down and compress it a bit. And then now whenever that frequency comes on, you'll have a custom-made compression curve that has been guided by the frequency spectrum. Because sometimes hunting for this can just be annoying as crap, and you need to be working quickly if you're on a deadline. And other times, you want to use your ears. So for example, for me, that's way too much compression. Other times, maybe you really want to slam it. So there's some uses of the spectrogram. There are literally just endless uses sort of for this display. There's also various ways it can be displayed to you. So I've shown you a couple, but I want to really quick show you one that's really important because it's sort of one's intuitive and one isn't. And you may have been working with an unintuitive one without realizing it. So if I open up a signal analyzer and a wave candy at the same time, so here's a spectrogram. I'm going to change the scale though. So this one has a much different scale than this one. Notice that this one goes from 31 to 63 to 125 to 250. It's doubling every time, 1,000 to 2,000. So we have a times 2 thing going on here. Over here, we have no times 2 thing. It's just 20 to 1K to 2K to 5K. We see it as linear. The distances represented, like this is a distance of 1,000. This is a distance of 3,000, and here we have a distance of 5,000. So it is a linear scale. We can also do a linear scale here. And you might be going, what's the big deal about a linear scale? Well, if I play a sound, here's a sine wave, and we hear frequencies in log base 2. All that means is that when I play a note that is twice this frequency, so what is this? About 250. This should be a little above 500 because this is a little above 250. And I'm claiming that it will sound like the same note. So check it out. And we see that it moves appropriately. That's a distance that's quite a ways on this graph. So we see a movement of that kind. On this graph, though, it hardly moves at all. Barely anything. And if I were to go even higher, now as we go higher, we can actually make bigger jumps and we hear less of a distance. Because, for example, if we were to start at 20 hertz, if we jump to 40 hertz, we would have to fit, that's 1 octave. That would sound, we would fit 12 notes in a range of just 20 hertz. But if we jump up to, say, 5,000 hertz and go all the way up to 10,000 hertz, we would put the same 12 notes in 5,000 hertz. So scale is a big deal. We want to work with a scale that makes sense to us. So it makes sense to work with a scale that is built the way we perceive things. So you generally want to have log on, and we hear in log base 2. So for example, if I play these low notes, you probably hear quite a difference between those two notes. They're very different. But here, it looks like we're playing the same friggin' note. That's not cool. So a lot of times, spectrograms will include a ability to change the scale. There we go. Got a couple windows open here. So it makes sense to bring our scale up because now we actually see a movement happening. So that's really important to us. So anyways, that is what a spectrogram is for. There's a couple uses for the spectrogram. And something to note with the scale. I do have a video explaining the logs, which I think is really important to understand as an audio engineer, specifically how the logs work, because they come up in volume too. For example, if you want the volume to sound like it is doubled, you actually need to increase it 10 times, which is pretty crazy, and it's a little confusing, but it really helps if you just have a good explanation. So I've got a video called Logarithms for Audio Engineers, and if I remember, at some point, I'll add it to the description of this video. It's really pretty helpful. And also, you'll understand logarithms better than a lot of math students. A lot of students just memorize how it works, and it's horribly unintuitive. So having some examples in real life really helps. So let's get back on track here. So there's that Vectorscopes. Vectorscopes are next. So this is a Vectorscope. There's other types of Vectorscopes, and they can be displayed a little differently, just like all these can. But a Vectorscope is really handy dandy because it gives you information about monocompatibility. A lot of people tell you this is like how your song is going, this is where your sounds are in space. And that's false because it's a machine. A machine, it doesn't have a brain. So for example, if I were to come up to a Vectorscope and be like, yo, Vectorscope, dude, where is this sound in space? A Vectorscope wouldn't know. It's just a graph. You know, sound has to come into you, go around your brain, go around your head, get into your brain, and then your brain tells you where you think the sound is. If you have just the fact that you're a different person, if we were both standing and then I very close to the same spot, you and I could have very different results just because our brains are different. It's very unlikely, but maybe you had some sort of brain injury or something. So your ability to tell where things are is off. So a vector scope does not necessarily tell you this. It does give you information about space though. And it does this through phase. So this is a fancy kind of oscilloscope. Basically, if a sound is in between these 45-degree lines, you see the ones labeled like RL, RL. If it's in between these lines, you have a sound that experiences constructive interference. All this means is that the sound on one side is adding to the sound on the other side. So if you were to play this out of one speaker, you would get a louder sound, not a softer sound. And if it's in this region here, this like sort of region in between the lines, that means it's deconstructive interference. So if you were to add the left channel of information to the right channel, it would subtract. So some people will use phase effects to accomplish very wide sounding vocals. And I'll show you this all when I go over this in more detail. And the problem with that is if you ever play it over your phone and you don't support the voice in the middle, your voice is going to sound really crappy on like a little phone because the two channels will subtract from each other and you'll get a really phasery sounding voice. So let me give you an example of that and show you a couple quick things. So here is a sine wave that is mono. We notice it forms a vertical line. This is because it's mono, meaning that the same exact signal, it's in phase with itself and everything is coming out the left and right channel. So if I were to pan this to the left, just a sec here. If I were to pan, I sent an effects out. If I were to pan it, we notice I get a line on the positive left, minus left. That's because this is an oscilloscope still. So it's actually, if you just use left to right on your, not left to right, XY on your oscilloscope, if you had like an analog one, you could set it up just like this. It's an easy thing to do. So the positive cycle of our signal is going towards the plus and the negative side is going towards the negative. So it's like it's going back and forth like we saw going up and down, only now it's just being drawn back and forth on a line. And if I were to pan it the other way, I'd get the right channel. And so with this in mind, we might ask ourselves, what if I sent out another sine wave but panned one way and one the other way? I still get a mono signal. And you might be going, why is that? Well, they're perfectly in phase. There's no phase cancellation. And since they always add together and they always add by the same amount, they're going to stay in the same spot in space. But as soon as the same spot in phase, it does have spatial implications though. As soon as I change the phase of one, we will expect it to change. And we will expect some deconstructive interference. So let's go here, go to our first form, and I can draw a little line to change the starting point. So if we look here, my waveform is starting going down, and this one's starting going up. So we would expect some interference to occur, and we'll actually end up with this. A circle. We'll get a circle. It's really cool. You can draw, so you can like draw music with this. It's called oscilloscope music. If you haven't checked it out, you really should. I'll put some links in the description, whatever. I'll put them down there in the doobly-doo. And in there, if you've never seen it, it's really pretty cool. And you can really geek out with the math and get really specific and draw things. I don't remember his name, but there's a guy who this is like what he does. He's not really posted anything for a while though. So an important thing I want to show you is, so we notice that mono is basically the epitome of being up and down mono. It's like that's going to come through on a phone speaker fine. But if I put these two signals completely out of phase, so let's see if I can get this pretty close here. That looks pretty good. So one will be going down while the other's going up, and so they'll cancel out, but they're going out of separate speakers. So your brain has to make sense of this, And this is something where a headphone mixing doesn't really make sense because if you're listening in a acoustic space, the space will actually cause additional interference, and you get a really different sounding effect. It almost bothers me a little bit when it's isolated like this. Over the headphones, though, it's not as bothersome and it sounds different. So you might consider pulling these off and listening over speakers and then putting them on. But check it out. So we're trying to make a horizontal line, right? Which would mean total cancellation. I mean, they're completely out of phase with each other, but they're coming out of different channels. And there we go. Yeah, that's just a weird deal. So you might try that with a voice, move one off. So if you ever have a signal that's got a lot here and a lot here, it's going to cancel a lot. If it's in the middle, it's going to be constructive and you will hear a lot. So understanding this is a really easy thing to just look at and go, oh, this is what's going on. Some of them also include a little meter on the bottom to tell you which way it tends. And I also want to say you've probably noticed the louder a note is, the further the graph will go. A lot of these graphs have a limit, at 1. They don't go off the screen. And if you ever see a Vectorscope that just has all the branches, like usually there's some that are like diamonds, some that are, like this sort of open. If you ever see them hitting the maximum, like they go all the way out, that means that song is either clipping, which is a bad thing. You don't want to be clipping, or has been heavily compressed. And if that's been done intentionally, then okay. But you always want to be aware of that. Make sure you're listening at adequate volume levels when you mess with this kind of stuff. So that's the basics of what these tools are. This is pretty self-explanatory as far as its applications, besides oscilloscope music, which is cool. So now I'm going to go over each of these again in a little more detail, fill in some things that I may have not said, and also give you some more examples of how this stuff works. And I'm going to get a little more thorough. So here we go. Let's jump into this more detailed version. So I want to start off by really quick defining digital audio. So remember, digital audio is digits. It's numbers and it's audio. So it's numbers that represent audio. And because the computer can't handle, infinite numbers, it can't handle continuous signals. Because a continuous signal, what that means is it's a graph. You could zoom in forever and there'll always be a point on there. And things like voltage or my voice, if we were to record it, the graph itself, the function, we'd be able to zoom in forever and ever and ever. But a computer can't handle it. So what it does is it takes samples, a bunch of samples right there in a row. We call it the sample rate, and it graphs that. So actually between our data, there are holes. And we can interpolate to figure out what's in between these. And we've got all sorts of, there's a whole field of math just for that. But basically, the way you want to look at audio when you're looking at things like this is, it's basically just a huge list of points, just a massive list of points. And so it's actually called a real discrete time signal because we're using real numbers. We're not using I or J if you're an engineer, electrical engineer. So we're using real numbers, integers, and they are defined. They are also a time ordered sequence, meaning the order matters, which is kind of obvious, but we're doing math here. So we got to state the obvious. So we have a list of numbers and we give it to the computer and it reads these numbers out in the order they're supposed to go in. And through the miracle of digital to analog conversion, we can get it back to our speakers. We can actually hear what we're doing. And so that's why having good converters is so important. If your ability to generate these numbers is crap, your sound's just going to be crap. So these numbers are the thing we care about. So basically now there's not really too much to add to the oscilloscope because, it's just graphing these numbers over time. Nothing crazy there. And as far as the spectrogram, there's not really either that much more to add here. I could give you some more examples, but honestly, you can go ahead and view it. But what I would like to do is show you just a couple more plug-in examples of these things. So on Wave Candy, you can see if I play a note, we could see that it's got a color. And so a lot of things, a lot of plugins will try to convey to you the amplitude, and it will try to convey to you the frequencies. that are going through it, just like a spectrogram would. So in this one, it also tries to convey time. So you see it scrolls through at time, so we can see the time the signal takes, how long a particular frequency was held. And sometimes this can also be mapped on a loudness history graph, which I'll show you in a second. And it also has a, with the amplitude, it shows you, darker is softer, brighter is more intense. This can be really helpful, especially if you're messing with a filter and you want to see resonance sweeps. All the frequencies are still there, but if they're all the same color, there's no way to tell where the resonance is. So let me show you what I mean. And actually, this is a great example. They actually have one built into Harmor. It's a little less specific though, because it's meant for sound design. Here's a spectrum, a big fat saw wave. And I want to, do a low, I want to sweep my filter around, but I want to have some resonance, which is basically wherever this frequency cutoff is, that's going to be louder due to resonate. Those frequencies will resonate more. And you can see that is very clearly conveyed here and here as well. And so this is a really nice feature. Now you notice this continues to scroll, this doesn't. So just different purposes, you can look at your spectrum and sort of get an idea of what's going on. Now I want to show you a 2D and 3D one as well. So I'm not sure if it's still a thing, but there's actually, if you're a student, they oftentimes make Isotope Insight free to get. If you join like, I have all these rocketry organizations, which are all a bunch of, I'm not going to say it because I'm just going to butcher it. I just know I am. But there's organizations that if you join, oftentimes they'll include Isotope Insight for free. Usually it's a subscription. So you can think about doing that. But Isotope Insight has all these things like right here, really nice. They've even got some loudness history going on. But they have what's really interesting is they have this spectrogram that's 3-dimensional. I don't ever really use 3-dimensional spectrograms, but I'm sure you could include them in cool ways and plugins. But basically, we have the amplitude as the height. We have we can clearly see time, and we can actually see seconds along the side. So as it moves, it's still got like local units. And we've also got frequency up top. And you can even change your view. I'm kind of a analyzer junkie. I love analyzers just because they analyze things. And it can look really cool. And so this is just really cool. They also have a 2-dimensional one, just like you would see out of Wave Candy. Maybe Wave Candy will one day support 3D, which would be pretty amazing. So I just wanted to show you that on spectrograms. When you see them, they'll be really intuitive. The most important takeaway really is just understanding that you're looking at a scale and you want to know what scale you're looking at. Otherwise, it's weird. In the past, I've always posted my tracks with a linear spectrogram. Someone finally asked about it, and I was like, you know what? Yeah, I guess I'll change it because Wave Candy pops up by default in a linear fashion like this. And it's like, oh yeah. And it's a more interesting experience because all the interesting stuff that we would think is interesting is happening down here anyways. So even below that, like in this tiny space, what's happening up here is usually not anywhere near as impressive as what's going on down here. We spend forever perfecting. If I open up an EQ, let's see here. I always open up this one just because I'm really comfortable with it. But I also like the Melda Audio EQ, and there are several others. There's like Carve EQ by Kilohertz and stuff. But if we look here, this range from 20 hertz to 100 hertz, man, I spend forever sometimes on this range, especially with other people's tracks. And like it's just hilarious to me that when we see this versus this, it's like this range right here is like so much more important to us. So let's move over, and I just want to show you some cool things with the Vectorscope real quick. So it's called the Vectorscope because it's actually showing you vectors. However, it does get kind of dense as far as math goes, and I actually really enjoy it. I'm in linear algebra right now, and I'm just barely getting into like more intense transformations. If you know math, then you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, then don't sweat it too much. But this is a really cool, you can actually let me show you a couple basic graphs just to start you off with some cool shapes you can make. So I'm going to keep things in mono. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a difference by playing different frequencies. So, you know, if there are different frequencies, they'll be constructive or deconstructive based on the frequency that I'm playing. So first, I'm going to have one at a ratio 1 and the other at a ratio 2. So this one will always be playing an octave lower than this one. And you get these, they're called Lissajous curves. Lissajous. I just memorize it as Lisa Jew, but they're spelled all funny. And I've heard them said all sorts of ways by different instructors that I just call them that. So basically the way these work are, let's play a higher note. And get just a sec here. I think I do need my pen to be different. There we go. I did need that. So you get these curves. They're really cool. And it's based on the ratio between the two. So for example, this is 1 to 2. If I make this 2, it'll be the same. So we get a line. But if I make this like 4 versus 5, these are really, if you ever taken a trig class and your trig teacher didn't skip out on it like mine did, she was a good teacher and it was a 6-week class, so we couldn't exactly dive into it. So I had to read this on my own. But most trig teachers require you to graph these. So they have roots in sine and cosine. And they're really useful in calc too. But I could also point out cool things with sample rates and why some points are brighter on the graph than other points, but I'm afraid I'll scare some of you guys. So some of you guys eat this stuff for breakfast. So right now we're still in, we're keeping it pretty simple. Things are not moving. So I'm going to turn on unison and make it mono. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on this unison and put a pitch difference. So I'll have a phasing, a continual phasing occurring. Check it out. So what you're basically watching is you're watching these graphs change in real time. And that's because of the pitch difference I have going on here. And I need my panning all the way up. If it's not up, I'm just going to get a growing and shrinking line as they cancel and come back. So this is really fun to mess with. So for example, okay, that's what we got going on. As if the pitch difference is really large, you'll see the shape appear. I'll show you. It's really obvious. So that's pretty cool. Now let's go ahead and do some, let's just try and make an interesting shape. This is an FM plugin, so it has some cool things we can mess with. So we can make a square. What's really interesting is try out the square wave. Make sure you have some degree of oversampling on though. And you get it, it looks like it's teleporting. It's between the points. It's really fun to mess with. Here we go. So they have different ways of interpolating. I've found that I like string and bring the thickness down. You're going to want your update up. This is going to increase the resolution. You see, that's a little more clear. I'm going to have to make this softer in post because I have to play things a little louder than I want to. So let's go ahead. Let's go down. We've got a square. Perhaps we don't want a square. Let's bring up the pitch. And then the controls for Wave Candy are always disappearing. I wish you could anchor them somewhere. That's something I should go and just request on their thing. Be like, hey, it'd be really sweet if we could anchor this on like the bottom, the toolbar or something. That'd be crazy. I'm not sure if that's possible. So see, to me, these are just cool shapes, cool things you can mess with. And you could spend a long time thinking about this, but what I recommend is for your first ones, just make a sine wave, make a vertical line first mess with the unison. So, okay, process for learning this if you're interested. Start with this wave. Experiment with panning on one and the other. After you've done experimenting with panning, add a second sine wave. You don't have to be using this plug. Change the panning. Try changing the panning one way or the other. So you get a vibe for like what controls what. And try changing the volume and then altering the panning. You can get a lot of different shapes. After you've done that, feel free to mess with the waveforms. Check out how it messes with it. I don't know, try and spell your name, you know. You can even try automating things, and that you're officially making oscilloscope music at that point, because you're making music for the way it looks, which is counterintuitive. So after you're done with that, I encourage you to mess with something that has some sort of phasing quality to it, such as a unison. And really pay close attention to your pitch control and watch your panning. Try changing your panning as well. It'll make your image a little more narrow. And then some fun ones are messing with things like DC offset. Or this isn't DC offset, but it's a DC signal. And because DC offset's when the average moves. Try messing with just, automate things, move things around. At this point, you're in the game, like get crazy. And then you can get like really crazy if you want and begin adding multiple signals into one from multiple sources and try making pictures. And away you go. So anyways, that is the scopes. That's how they're used in a mix. Just to recap for them. Oscilloscope, real-time waveform. The spectrogram shows you the frequencies, but you've seen now several examples of why you would want that. And various places you'll see it. You'll see them like in a lot of places. They're just a really great feedback tool. One thing we haven't talked about is phase plots, because they're like never really used. But they're important to know about when you use filters. I usually bring them up in the context where they're more important. They're especially important to know about when mastering. So you'll see them included in mastering plugins more often than anywhere else. For example, if I pull open Isotope Ozone, they are they point out exactly what a filter will do to the phase. And I also point out things like in the Maximus series on why you might not want to use Maximus for mastering. But you could try throwing it on, and if you like what it does, then of course keep it. So for example, if I move on around, you can see I have a phase delay line and a phase response. And a phase delay is actually how a filter works. So, and I need to talk about quite a bit of digital audio at that point. So I don't really want to open that can of worms. I'm not prepared to at this stage. But basically, phasing is not always a bad thing. And all your filters are doing this to one extent or another. The more severe the cutoff, the crazier this graph's going to look. So when you do things like, if you open up TDR Nova, they offer a 72 decibel. And if you own it, they offer an even steeper one, cutoff curve. And if you think this thing does not have repercussions, it totally does. If you put this all the way up to max, where'd my mouse go? There it goes. That really caused a problem. If you put this thing all the way up to max, you will see noise and stuff over here, depending on how you do this. There's sort of if I mess with it, I can show you, but I don't want to go through the bother of setting all this up right now. But basically, this is gonna mess with your signal like a lot. So there are ways of doing it. Oversampling and other techniques have impacts on what's going on. But just wanted to point that out. So when you see really steep curves, a phase plot just isn't something we talked about. Normally is a non-issue. And in general mixing cases, like if I'm gonna like put a brick wall in to cut off part of a kick, usually I'm not concerned about the super high-end noise because it's negligible. But you never know. Maybe to you, it's going to be really important, or maybe you do notice a difference. And sometimes you can get things like transients of kicks to have subtle differences. So just to be aware of that. And where is my notebook? Whatever. So, and then we have the Vectorscope. And remember, this shows you phase relationships. It's not a all-knowledgeable source on where things are located in space. A lot of things that claim to do this, like visual mixers, be kind of suspect of this. They're all going to have to use tricks of phase and delay natures in order to get this done. So, and it's all based on interference between plugs. So it's kind of like, your ears are the judge. And when you're mixing for space, mixing over monitors can make a rather large difference. Try doing that phase cancellation thing, maybe with a voice. Put one voice, like grab a voice. Let's do it right now. Let's see. Do I have a vocal impact? Vocals aren't something I regularly grab. And I'm not grabbing anything out of that folder. That's a folder of scary past things. Let's go to, you know what? Sample pack. Vocals.
Go. 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1, go. 3.
Whatever. We'll use this. Yeah, I've got acapella somewhere on here. So, okay, there it is. We're going to clone it. And so if we play them out right now and look at our thing, of course, it's already a pretty dynamic signal, so we're going to expect to see some stuff.
3, 2, 1, go.
But we notice it's all pretty much within our 2 lines. So let's take one and pan it left and take the other and pan it right. Oh, we need to make it unique. Make it unique and pan it right.
3, 2, 1, go.
It doesn't really make a difference yet. Now we're going to reverse polarity on one.
3, 2, 1, go.
And now we see it is flipped axes. It is now in the middle. If you were to play this over a phone, it will appear to have disappeared. If we put it in the middle, there is nothing appearing. So that is a way to, and now over the headphones,
3, 2, 1, go.
you may not notice, did I not pan something all the way? Nope. Now you notice that skewed it. So that's a really interesting sort of takeaway. And so over the headphones, really different experience than over monitors. It really is. It sounds much wider over monitors, in my opinion, than it does over headphones. And over a phone, as you've seen, it just disappears. Now, you might not have that. This is an extreme example. You might not have something this extreme. And so it will sound phasery because it'll do what our sine wave with the unison was doing earlier. It'll come in and out of phase. And it's a common thing you'll see posted on like Reddit or like gearglutz.com. People wondering, why does my thing sound so weird? This is why. If you have any questions about any of these topics, let me know. I hope I was straightforward and clear and relatively to the point. I did go into a little bit of detail on some because I thought it was cool information worth sharing. Subscribe and have a blessed day.